Power doesn't always announce itself with a badge. Sometimes it wears a tailored suit and stays dead silent while you make the biggest mistake of your life. When Officer Derek Sullivan delivered a stinging slap across the face of an unidentified black man demanding accountability in his precinct lobby, he thought he was just putting another civilian in his place. He had no idea the man wiping blood from his lip was Isaiah Brooks, the new precinct captain sent to clean house. Rain lashed against the windshield of the unassuming gray sedan as it idled half a block away from the 54th precinct in downtown Detroit. Inside, Isaiah Brooks sat perfectly still, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. At 42, Isaiah possessed a quiet, unyielding intensity that had earned him a fearsome reputation during his 15 years in Chicago's Internal Affairs Division. He had dismantled corruption rings, put crooked cops behind bars, and navigated the treacherous political waters of a major metropolitan police force. Now he was here. The mayor of Detroit had personally requested his transfer, promising him full autonomy to gut the 54th precinct, a notoriously corrupt and dysfunctional district that had been bleeding the city dry through lawsuits and sheer incompetence. Isaiah glanced at the dashboard clock. It was exactly 7:30 in the morning. His official introduction as the new precinct captain wasn't scheduled until the 9 o'clock roll call. The outgoing captain had supposedly retired abruptly under a cloud of suspicion, leaving a leadership vacuum that the rank and file had enthusiastically exploited. Deputy Chief Robert Harrison had warned him that the men and women of the 54th were a tightly knit, hostile fraternity. They did not take kindly to outsiders, and they certainly wouldn't roll out the red carpet for a black man coming in to disrupt their deeply ingrained toxic culture. Instead of showing up in his dress blues, surrounded by brass and fanfare, Isaiah had chosen a different approach. He wore a sharp charcoal gray trench coat over a simple black turtleneck and slacks. No badge, no weapon visible, just a citizen walking into a public building. He wanted to see how his officers behaved when they thought nobody important was watching. Stepping out into the biting November chill off the Detroit River, Isaiah pulled his collar up against the wind and walked briskly toward the precinct. The building itself looked tired. Its brick facade was stained with decades of city grime, standing in the shadow of the weathered skyline near the old industrial corridors of downtown. Pushing through the heavy glass double doors, he was immediately hit by the stale, unmistakable odor of cheap institutional coffee, floor wax, and unwashed bodies. The lobby was sparsely populated, but humming with low, anxious energy. A few civilians sat on hard plastic chairs, looking exhausted and defeated. Behind the thick, bullet-resistant glass of the front desk sat Sergeant Miller, a heavy-set man aggressively ignoring the elderly woman standing directly in front of him. Isaiah took a position near a bulletin board plastered with outdated community notices, pretending to read a flyer while keeping his eyes and ears entirely focused on the room. "Excuse me, officer," the elderly woman pleaded, her voice trembling. "I've been waiting since 6 o'clock. My grandson hasn't come home, and I just want to file a missing persons report." Miller didn't even look up from his smartphone. "Like I told you an hour ago, Mrs. Higgins, he's probably just sleeping off a bender. We don't file on adults until it's been 48 hours. Go home." Before Mrs. Higgins could protest further, the heavy security door leading to the back offices swung open, and 2 patrol officers swaggered into the lobby. They were holding steaming cups of coffee and laughing loudly. Isaiah's sharp eyes immediately cataloged their details. Officer Derek Sullivan, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a closely cropped haircut and a sneer that seemed permanently etched into his features. Beside him was Officer Bradley Hayes, slightly shorter, his uniform visibly unkempt. They possessed the arrogant, relaxed posture of men who believed they owned the building and everyone in it. "Hey, Sarge," Sullivan called out, leaning against the front desk and completely blocking Mrs. Higgins. "Did you catch the game last night? Absolute massacre." "Move aside, Sullivan," Mrs. Higgins said, her voice finding a desperate sliver of strength. "I was talking to him." Sullivan paused mid-sip, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at the diminutive woman. "Excuse me, are you telling me how to do my job in my own precinct, Grandma?" "I just want to report my grandson missing," she stammered, intimidated by his sudden aggression. "And Sarge told you to beat it," Hayes chimed in, chuckling. "Take a hint, lady. We aren't your personal babysitting service." Isaiah felt a familiar, icy anger bloom in his chest. This was exactly the kind of rot he had been sent to excise. It wasn't just incompetence, it was active, malicious disdain for the community they were sworn to protect. He stepped away from the bulletin board and walked calmly across the linoleum floor, his footsteps deliberate and precise. "Actually, gentlemen," Isaiah said, his voice smooth, but carrying a resonant authority that demanded the room's attention. "Department policy dictates that a missing persons report can be filed immediately if the subject is considered vulnerable or if the disappearance is highly uncharacteristic. Given that you haven't even taken her grandson's name, you have no way of knowing either." Silence fell over the lobby. Sergeant Miller finally looked up from his phone. Sullivan slowly turned around, his eyes raking over Isaiah from head to toe, assessing him. He saw a civilian, a black man in a nice coat who dared to quote policy at him. A condescending smirk spread across his face. "Well, look what we have here," Sullivan sneered, stepping away from the desk and closing the distance between them. "A regular legal scholar. Who the hell are you? The mayor's new diversity hire for the complaint department?" "I'm someone who expects officers in uniform to do the job the taxpayers fund them to do," Isaiah replied, not breaking eye contact, not stepping back an inch. Hayes snorted in the background, "Oh, he's feisty, Derek. Better watch out." Sullivan stepped closer, invading Isaiah's personal space. The smell of cheap cologne and stale tobacco radiated off him. "Listen to me very carefully, mister. You walk in here, you start yapping about policy, you start disrespecting my uniform, that's a good way to find yourself sitting in a holding cell for disorderly conduct. Now, turn around, walk out those doors, and mind your own damn business." "Your badge number is 4492, Isaiah stated calmly, looking pointedly at the silver shield on his chest. "Officer Sullivan, and yours is 5103, Officer Hayes. You are both actively violating the department's code of conduct regarding civilian interactions." Sullivan's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a raw, unhinged fury. He was not used to being challenged, let alone humiliated in his own lobby by someone he deemed completely powerless. "Shut your mouth," Sullivan barked, raising his hand. "Are you going to make me?" Isaiah challenged softly. The slap echoed through the quiet lobby like a gunshot. Pain flared across Isaiah's left cheek, hot and sudden. The sheer force of Derek Sullivan's backhand snapped his head to the side, dislodging a simple gold stud earring that clattered loudly onto the linoleum floor. The metallic bouncing sound was the only noise in the room. For a terrifying, breathless moment, the entire precinct lobby froze. Mrs. Higgins gasped, pressing her hands over her mouth in horror. Behind the thick glass, Sergeant Miller half stood from his chair, his eyes wide, but he made absolutely no move to intervene or hit the panic button. Isaiah slowly turned his head back to face Sullivan. He didn't raise his hand to his stinging cheek. He didn't stumble. He simply let his tongue run along the inside of his lower lip, tasting the unmistakable metallic tang of blood. When his eyes locked onto Sullivan's again, there was no fear in them. There wasn't even anger anymore. Instead, there was a cold, calculating emptiness that, for a fleeting second, made the burly officer hesitate. But Sullivan's ego was far too fragile, and his audience was watching. He couldn't back down now. He misinterpreted Isaiah's silence for shock, his stillness for submission. "I told you to shut your mouth," Sullivan snarled, though his voice wavered imperceptibly. He pointed a thick finger at Isaiah's face. "You want to come in here and cause a disturbance. You want to assault a police officer." Isaiah raised an eyebrow, a chilling half-smile touching his bloody lips. "Assault? Is that what we're calling it when your hand strikes my face?" "I saw him lunge," Bradley Hayes chimed in eagerly, stepping forward to back his partner up. The lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, revealing just how deeply the corruption ran. They covered for each other instinctively, fabricating narratives on the spot to justify their brutality. He was acting erratic, definitively a threat. "You're under arrest," Sullivan declared, his confidence surging back. He grabbed Isaiah's left arm, his grip bruising and unnecessarily violent, and spun him around. "On what charge?" Isaiah asked, keeping his voice completely level as he allowed himself to be maneuvered. He offered no physical resistance. He knew the law, and he knew that resisting would only give them legitimate grounds for the arrest they were currently faking. "Assaulting a sworn officer, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct," Sullivan listed off, yanking Isaiah's arms behind his back. "We'll think of a few more by the time we finish the paperwork." Hayes pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. The cold metal bit sharply into Isaiah's wrists as they ratcheted the cuffs down tight, far tighter than standard procedure dictated, designed to restrict circulation and inflict pain. "Read him his rights," Sullivan laughed, shoving him toward the heavy security door that led to the precinct's inner bowels. "You have the right to remain silent," Hayes mocked, leaning in close to Isaiah's ear as he pushed him forward. "Which I highly suggest you do, unless you want to trip and fall down a flight of stairs on the way to processing. Anything you say can and will be used to make your life a living hell. Understand?" Isaiah remained utterly silent. Every step they took, every threat they uttered, was a nail in their professional coffins. He was committing everything to memory. The lack of intervention from the desk sergeant, the fabricated charges, the physical abuse, the intimidation tactics. They were handing him the exact justification he needed to clean house, wrapped in a neat, undeniable package. They hauled him down a long, fluorescent-lit hallway. The walls were scuffed, and the floor tiles were peeling. Isaiah intentionally scanned the ceiling corners. As he suspected, the security cameras pointing down the processing corridor had their red power lights extinguished, sabotaged. It was a classic move for a precinct that routinely violated civil rights. No cameras meant no objective witnesses. "Keep moving," Sullivan grunted, giving him another rough shove between his shoulder blades. They bypassed the standard booking desk entirely. There was no fingerprinting, no mugshot, no entry logged into the computer system. They were intentionally holding him off the books, a deeply illegal intimidation tactic meant to terrify a citizen into submission before releasing him hours later, with a warning to keep his mouth shut. They reached the holding area at the back of the precinct. The smell of ammonia and stale urine was overpowering. Hayes unlocked the heavy iron door of cell number 3. Sullivan practically threw Isaiah inside. He stumbled but managed to keep his footing, turning around just in time to see the iron bars slam shut with a deafening clang. "Sit tight, legal scholar," Sullivan smirked through the bars, tapping his nightstick against the metal. We'll come check on you in a few hours. Maybe by then, you'll have learned how to show some respect." The two officers walked away, their laughter echoing down the concrete block hallway until the heavy reinforced door at the end clicked shut, leaving Isaiah alone in the dim light. Isaiah exhaled a long, steady breath. Despite the throbbing pain in his cheek and the numbness creeping into his tightly bound hands, he felt a profound sense of clarity. He surveyed his surroundings. The cell was small, containing a single metal bench bolted to the wall and an exposed toilet. Sitting on the far end of the bench was a young woman, no older than 20, clutching a thin, ragged jacket around her shoulders. She looked at Isaiah with wide, terrified eyes. "They got you too," the young woman whispered, her voice shaking. Isaiah walked over to the bench and carefully sat down, maintaining his rigid posture despite his bound hands. "What are you in here for?" "I don't even know," the girl choked out, tears spilling over her cheeks. "I was walking home from my shift at the diner. Officer Sullivan pulled his cruiser over. He told me to get in. When I said no, he threw me in the back. Said I matched the description of a shoplifter. He's been keeping me in here since midnight. He keeps coming back telling me that if I'm nice to him, he'll lose the paperwork." A dark, dangerous fire ignited in Isaiah's eyes. It was one thing to be arrogant and physically abusive. It was another entirely to use a badge for predatory extortion. The rot in the 54th precinct wasn't just administrative. It was malignant. Isaiah twisted his wrist slightly, testing the tension of the handcuffs. He then turned his head to look at the small digital clock mounted on the wall outside the cells. It read 8:15 a.m. 45 minutes until roll call. 45 minutes until Deputy Chief Harrison arrived with the brass to formally introduce the new captain to the morning shift. "Don't worry," Isaiah told the young woman softly, a razor-sharp edge to his tone that cut through the gloom of the cell. "Officer Sullivan is going to have a very bad day." Time ticked by, with agonizing slowness in the subterranean gloom of the 54th Precinct's holding area. Isaiah Brooks sat perfectly still, conserving his energy while carefully committing every detail of Chloe Davis's terrifying ordeal to memory. The young woman wept softly, her thin frame shivering against the chilled concrete wall. Isaiah asked gentle, probing questions, extracting the exact timeline of Sullivan's predatory behavior, the specific threats he whispered, and the locations of his illegal stops. Every word was ammunition. Every tear was a guarantee that Derek Sullivan's career was breathing its final ragged breaths. Upstairs, the atmosphere was entirely different. At 10 minutes to 9, the main squad room was packed with officers milling around, sipping coffee, and trading crude jokes before the mandatory morning roll call. Derek Sullivan and Bradley Hayes were holding court near the briefing podium, loudly recounting their weekend exploits. Sullivan stood with his chest puffed out, feeling utterly untouchable. He had just put a mouthy civilian in his place, asserting his dominance over the precinct lobby, and now he was ready to coast through another shift of doing absolutely nothing productive. "You should have seen his face," Sullivan chuckled, leaning against a heavily scratched wooden desk. "Thought he was some high-powered lawyer coming in to lecture us. One little slap and he folded like a cheap lawn chair." Hayes laughed, tossing an empty sugar packet into a nearby trash can. "He was practically begging by the time we locked him up. Think we should leave him down there until lunch, let him marinate. Nah, we'll drag him up around 11, hit him with a resisting charge, and let him walk with a warning," Sullivan said dismissively. "It builds character." At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy oak doors of the squad room swung open. The casual banter died instantly as Deputy Chief Robert Harrison strode into the room, flanked by two stone-faced internal affairs detectives and Lieutenant James Carter, the shift commander. Harrison was a no-nonsense veteran with sharp gray eyes and a deep, gravelly voice that commanded immediate respect. He scanned the room, his brow furrowing when he didn't see the person he had explicitly come to introduce. "Attention on deck," Lieutenant Carter barked. The officers scrambled to their feet, hastily straightening their uniforms and standing at parade rest. Harrison stepped up to the podium, placing a thick manila folder on the surface. He looked out at the sea of officers, his expression tight with irritation. "Settle down. We have a change in command effective immediately. As you all know, this precinct has been operating under a cloud of administrative review for the past 6 months. The mayor has decided it is time for a complete overhaul. I am here this morning to introduce your new commanding officer." Harrison paused, looking toward the side door leading to the administrative offices. Nobody walked through. He frowned, pulling out his smartphone and tapping the screen. "Lieutenant Carter," Harrison said sharply, "where is Captain Brooks? He confirmed he would be arriving at 7:30 to observe the morning shift transition." Carter looked genuinely confused. "I haven't seen him, Deputy Chief. Nobody has checked in at the front desk under that name." Harrison's eyes narrowed. He dialed a number on his phone. Somewhere deep in the precinct, buried inside the confiscated property bin behind the booking desk, Isaiah's phone vibrated silently. Harrison ended the call, a deep sense of unease settling over him. Isaiah Brooks was legendary for his punctuality. If he wasn't standing at this podium, something was wrong. "Sergeant Miller," Harrison called out, spotting the desk sergeant hovering near the back of the room. "Did you log any visitors this morning? Anyone asking for me or Lieutenant Carter?" Miller shuffled his feet nervously, his eyes darting towards Sullivan. No, sir. Just the usual morning traffic. A few complaints, some loiterers, nothing out of the ordinary." "Are you sure about that, Miller?" Harrison asked, his voice dropping an octave. His instincts, honed over 3 decades on the force, were screaming that something was fundamentally off in this room. He noticed the slight arrogant smirk on Derek Sullivan's face and immediately zeroed in on him. "Hey, Officer Sullivan, you look like you have something to share." Sullivan stood a little taller, completely oblivious to the trap he was walking into. "Just an eventful morning, Deputy Chief. Had a disturbed individual come into the lobby causing a massive scene. Threatened officers, tried to assault us. We had to subdue him and put him in a holding cell to cool off." Harrison stared at him, a cold dread washing over him. "A disturbed individual. Describe him." Sullivan shrugged carelessly. "Black male, early 40s, dressed up like he thought he was somebody important. Kept quoting department policy like a textbook before he got violent. Standard crazy." The color drained entirely from Deputy Chief Harrison's face. The 2 internal affairs detectives flanking him stiffened, their hands instinctively moving closer to their duty weapons. Lieutenant Carter gasped audibly. The entire room seemed to suck in a collective, horrified breath as the reality of Sullivan's words slowly dawned on the senior command staff. "You put a man matching that description in a holding cell," Harrison said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. It wasn't a question. "Did you log his arrest? Did you process him through the system?" "Well, sir, he was resisting, so we just tossed him in cell 3 until we could do the paperwork," Hayes piped up, trying to sound professional, but failing miserably under Harrison's lethal stare. "Lieutenant Carter," Harrison ordered, not breaking eye contact with Sullivan, "take my internal affairs detail and secure the front desk. Nobody leaves this building. Nobody touches a computer. Sullivan, Hayes, you're going to walk me down to holding block right this second, and pray to whatever God you believe in that the man in cell 3 is not who I think he is." Ignorance finally gave way to a creeping, suffocating panic. Sullivan's heart hammered against his ribs as he was escorted out of the squad room, the heavy, silent footsteps of the deputy chief pressing down on him like an anvil. They marched down the fluorescent-lit hallway past the booking desk and stopped in front of the heavy iron doors of the holding area. "Open it," Harrison commanded. Sullivan's hands trembled violently as he fumbled with the heavy brass ring of keys. He jammed the key into the lock, twisting it with a loud clank, and pulled the heavy door open. The ammonia smell washed over them. Harrison pushed past Sullivan, striding rapidly down the row of cages until he stopped dead in front of cell number 3. Behind the bars, Isaiah Brooks sat calmly on the metal bench, his hands bound tightly behind his back. A vicious, dark purple bruise was blooming across his left cheek, and dried blood caked his split lip. "Captain Brooks," Harrison breathed, absolute horror choking his words. Sullivan felt the floor drop out from underneath him. The world spun. His lungs forgot how to process oxygen. He stared at the man he had slapped, the man he had unlawfully imprisoned, the man he had mocked. Isaiah slowly stood up, his gaze bypassing Harrison entirely, to lock onto Sullivan's pale, terrified face. "Deputy Chief," Isaiah said smoothly, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the cell block. "I believe my introduction to the shift is slightly overdue." Absolute silence descended upon the holding block, heavy and suffocating like a wet wool blanket. Officer Derek Sullivan stood frozen, his eyes wide and vacant, as if his brain had simply short-circuited, trying to process the magnitude of his error. Beside him, Bradley Hayes looked like he was about to vomit, his face taking on a sickly greenish pallor. The arrogant smirks, the swagger, the untouchable bravado, all of it had been incinerated in a single, catastrophic instant. "Unlock this cell immediately," Deputy Chief Harrison roared, his voice shaking with a terrifying, unbridled fury. He spun around, grabbing Sullivan by the collar of his uniform and violently shoving him toward the bars. "Unlock it now!" Sullivan's hands shook so badly, he dropped the ring of heavy iron keys onto the concrete floor. The metallic clatter echoed sharply. He dropped to his knees, scrambling to pick them up, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. It took him 3 agonizing attempts to fit the key into the lock of cell number 3. When the heavy iron door finally swung open, Harrison stepped forward, reaching out to guide Isaiah out of the cage. "Captain Brooks, I am so deeply sorry," Harrison began, reaching behind him to inspect the handcuffs. "Let's get these off you." "Stop," Isaiah commanded, his voice slicing through the air like a scalpel. He didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his hands still tightly bound behind his back. He looked at Harrison, his eyes cold and calculating. "Do not remove the cuffs yet, Robert. I need internal affairs down here right now to photograph the restraints. I want the ratcheting documented. I want the lack of double locking documented. I want the bruising on my wrists officially entered into evidence before they are removed." Harrison swallowed hard, nodding sharply. He turned to one of the IA detectives who had followed them down. "Get the camera, now." Isaiah then turned his attention to Sullivan, who was still practically cowering near the cell door. "Officer Sullivan, you failed to mention to the deputy chief that I was not the only person you were holding completely off the books today." Isaiah nodded his head toward the dark corner of the cell. Chloe Davis sat huddled on the bench, trembling with fear, her eyes darting between the high-ranking officers and the men who had tormented her. "This is Chloe Davis," Isaiah stated, his voice carrying a lethal precision. "She was abducted, and yes, I am using that legal term deliberately, by Officer Sullivan at approximately midnight. She has been held here without charge, without a phone call, and without record. Furthermore, she has been subjected to repeated sexual extortion by this officer in exchange for her undocumented release. Hayes let out a pathetic whimpering sound, taking a step backward as if trying to merge with the cinder block wall. Sullivan tried to speak, but only a dry, raspy croak escaped his throat. "Lieutenant Carter," Harrison barked to the shift commander standing at the end of the hall, "get paramedics down here immediately to evaluate Ms. Davis. Then get her a warm blanket, food, and have Detective Foster take her statement personally. Nobody in uniform goes near her." As the internal affairs detective arrived with a high-resolution digital camera, the flash illuminated the dark hallway. He meticulously photographed Isaiah's bruised and bloody face, the torn fabric of his coat, and the deep, angry red indentations carved into his wrists by the over-tightened steel cuffs. Only after the detective gave a curt nod did Isaiah allow Harrison to unlock the cuffs. He brought his arms forward, wincing slightly as the blood rushed painfully back into his numb fingers. He slowly massaged his wrists, his eyes never leaving Sullivan's face. "Captain Brooks." "I didn't know," Sullivan stammered, his voice pathetic and weak. It was the desperate plea of a bully who had finally cornered a predator much larger than himself. "If you had known who I was, you would have treated me with respect," Isaiah interrupted, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "But because you thought I was just a citizen, a black man asking for accountability, you believed you had the right to brutalize me. You didn't assault me because of a misunderstanding, Sullivan. You assaulted me because this is who you are. This is what you do when you think nobody with power is watching." He stopped inches from Sullivan's face. Despite being shorter than the burly patrolman, Isaiah's presence completely dominated the space. He radiated an absolute, terrifying authority. "Your badge," Isaiah demanded, extending his right-hand palm up. Sullivan stared at his hand, his lower lip trembling. "Captain, please, I have 20 years on the force." "Your badge and your weapon, Officer Sullivan," Isaiah repeated, his tone lowering to a dangerous whisper. "Hand them over now, or my next order will be to have the deputy chief physically disarm you and place you in handcuffs for the felony assault of a superior officer." With trembling hands, Sullivan unpinned the silver shield from his chest and placed it into Isaiah's palm. He then unbuckled his heavy leather duty belt, the holster containing his service weapon thudding heavily against the concrete floor. Isaiah turned to Bradley Hayes. "You too, Officer Hayes. Accessory to assault, falsifying a police narrative, unlawful detention, and conspiracy to commit extortion. Strip the belt." Hayes didn't talk back. Tears streamed down his face as he hastily removed his badge and gun, dropping them next to Sullivan's. "Internal Affairs," Isaiah called out over his shoulder, tossing the 2 silver badges to the detectives. "Place these 2 men under arrest. Read them their rights, the real ones, not the fabricated version they use to terrorize civilians. Then process them strictly by the book. They are going into isolation cells at central booking. I want a full search of their lockers, their patrol vehicle, and their personal vehicles. We are pulling their entire jacket, every arrest, every complaint, every use of force report they have ever filed. Captain, you can't just end our lives like this over one mistake," Sullivan cried out as the IA detectives moved in, grabbing his arms and violently forcing them behind his back. The loud click of handcuffs echoed in the hall, a poetic, brutal reversal of fate. "It wasn't one mistake, Derek," Isaiah said coldly, wiping a small drop of dried blood from his chin. "It was a culture of rot, and as of this exact second, I am the cure." Isaiah turned his back on the 2 disgraced men as they were hauled away, their protests echoing pitifully down the corridor. He looked at Deputy Chief Harrison, who was watching him with a mixture of profound respect and lingering shock. "Robert," Isaiah said, straightening his collar and adjusting the lapels of his trench coat. I believe I have a roll call to address. Have Lieutenant Carter gather everyone back in the squad room. Nobody leaves. We are locking this precinct down." The house cleaning hadn't just begun. It had ignited with a nuclear blast, and Isaiah Brooks was just getting started. Tension hung heavy in the stale air of the main squad room, thick enough to suffocate the remaining officers of the morning shift. Lieutenant James Carter paced nervously near the front podium, his polished shoes scuffing against the cracked linoleum. It had been nearly 20 minutes since Deputy Chief Harrison had marched Derek Sullivan and Bradley Hayes out of the room, and the complete absence of information was breeding a palpable toxic paranoia among the ranks. The usual boisterous laughter and crude jokes had evaporated, replaced by anxious whispers and darting glances. Everyone knew Sullivan was untouchable. He was the ringleader, the undisputed alpha of the precinct's shadow hierarchy. If internal affairs had dragged him out, the entire house of cards was swaying in the wind. Footsteps echoed sharply from the administrative hallway. The heavy oak door swung open, and the room instantly snapped to a rigid, breathless attention. Deputy Chief Harrison entered first, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying fury. But it was the man stepping in right behind him who sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Isaiah Brooks walked to the front of the squad room with the measured, predatory grace of a lion claiming his territory. He had not cleaned his face. The vicious purple bruise left by Sullivan's backhand swelled prominently across his left cheekbone. A streak of dried blood extended from the corner of his split lip down to his chin. His charcoal trench coat bore the scuff marks of the holding cell wall, and his wrists, visibly exposed as he rested his hands on the wooden podium, were ringed with angry, dark red abrasions from the over-tightened steel cuffs. He stood there in total silence for 10 agonizing seconds. His piercing dark eyes systematically scanned the faces of the 52 officers standing before him. He committed every flinch, every averted gaze, every pale complexion to memory. Sergeant Miller, the desk sergeant who had aggressively ignored Mrs. Higgins and happily watched Isaiah get assaulted in the lobby, was standing in the second row. As Isaiah's eyes locked onto his, all the color drained from his fleshy face. His knees visibly buckled, and he had to grab the edge of a nearby desk to keep from collapsing. "For those of you who did not catch my name on the shift roster," Isaiah began, his voice low, smooth, and laced with pure adamantium, "I am Captain Isaiah Brooks. I am your new commanding officer. And as of this morning, I am your worst nightmare." A collective, barely suppressed shudder rippled through the ranks. 30 minutes ago, I walked into the front lobby of this building as a private citizen, Isaiah continued, his words ringing out like hammer strikes against an anvil. I witnessed an elderly woman being verbally abused and denied service by a sworn supervisor. I intervened. In response, Officer Derek Sullivan and Officer Bradley Hayes mocked me, physically assaulted me, illegally detained me, and locked me in a subterranean cage alongside a young woman they had abducted for the purpose of sexual extortion. Several officers gasped aloud. Lieutenant Carter closed his eyes, a look of profound nausea washing over his features. The sheer audacity of the crimes committed right under their noses was staggering, even for the 54th precinct. "They did this," Isaiah said, stepping out from behind the podium so they could fully see his battered appearance. "Because they thought I was a nobody. They thought I was just a black man who dared to speak up, a nuisance they could crush with absolute impunity. They operated under the assumption that this badge is a shield for predatory behavior, rather than a covenant with the community." Isaiah pointed a stiff finger directly at Sergeant Miller. "Sergeant Miller, step forward." Miller trembled violently as he shuffled out of the ranks. "Captain, I didn't know who you were. I swear to God I didn't know." That is exactly the point, Miller, Isaiah snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. You watched a citizen get backhanded across the face in your lobby, and you did absolutely nothing because you believed he had no power. You are a coward, you are complicit, and you are a disgrace to that uniform. Isaiah turned to the two internal affairs detectives standing near the doorway. Strip his badge and his weapon. Arrest him for dereliction of duty, accessory to felony assault, and official misconduct. Get him out of my sight. Miller openly sobbed as the detectives moved in, relieving him of his gun belt and snapping handcuffs over his wrists. The sight of a veteran sergeant being perp-walked out of his own squad room sent a shockwave of pure terror through the remaining patrolmen. The message was clear. Tenure, rank, and the fabled blue wall of silence meant absolutely nothing to Isaiah Brooks. Take a good look around this room, Isaiah commanded, his voice dropping back to that terrifyingly calm register. The culture of the 54th precinct died at 8 o'clock this morning. It is over. The extortion, the skimming, the illegal stops, the intimidation, every dirty secret you thought was buried is being dug up today. He turned to Lieutenant Carter, who snapped to attention, sweating profusely. Lieutenant, lock the front doors. Suspend all patrol operations for this precinct immediately. Reroute all 911 calls in our sector to the 42nd and 61st precincts. Nobody in this room touches a computer, a file cabinet, or a cell phone. If I see a phone in your hand, you are fired on the spot. Carter swallowed hard. Yes, Captain. The precinct is locked down. Good, Isaiah said, turning his back on the terrified officers and looking at Deputy Chief Harrison. Because we aren't just doing administrative review anymore, Robert. This entire building is now an active crime scene. Bring in the outside forensic tech teams. I want every hard drive cloned. I want every locker searched. We are tearing this place down to the studs. Hours bled into the late afternoon as the 54th precinct transformed from a functioning police station into a fortified fortress of investigation. A specialized cybercrimes unit from downtown headquarters arrived in unmarked vans, hauling heavy Pelican cases full of forensic extraction equipment. They systematically disconnected every computer in the building, bypassing the local servers entirely to prevent any remote wiping of data. Isaiah commandeered the captain's office, a spacious room that smelled faintly of stale cigars and cheap whiskey, the lingering ghosts of his disgraced predecessor. He refused to sit behind the massive mahogany desk, opting instead to stand over a large conference table that was rapidly filling up with evidence boxes, printed arrest logs, and seized duty weapons. Despite Deputy Chief Harrison's insistence that he visit the hospital for a proper medical evaluation, Isaiah refused to leave the building. An EMT had patched his split lip and applied a cold compress to his cheek, but he waved away any further treatment. The pain kept him sharp. The pain fueled the righteous fire burning in his chest. "Captain," Detective Sarah Foster called out, stepping into the office with a thick manila folder tucked under her arm. Foster was one of the few internal affairs investigators Isaiah trusted implicitly, a sharp, relentless hound who never let a scent go cold. "We finished tossing Sullivan's locker and his personal vehicle. You need to see this." Isaiah looked up from a stack of heavily redacted use-of-force reports. "What did you find?" Foster laid the folder on the table and opened it. Inside were a dozen clear evidence bags. Several contained thick wads of cash bound in rubber bands, easily totaling $50,000. But the most damning item was a small black leather notebook. Sullivan wasn't just shaking down petty criminals and vulnerable women on his night shifts, Foster explained, pointing to the notebook. He was running a highly organized protection racket. This ledger details weekly payouts from 3 different illegal gambling dens, a chop shop operating on the east side, and 2 mid-level narcotics distributors. He was charging them a tax to look the other way and using his squad car to escort their shipments. Isaiah flipped through the pages with a gloved hand, his eyes scanning the meticulous handwritten columns. Sullivan was arrogant and brutal, but he clearly possessed a terrifyingly efficient mind for criminal enterprise. Who else is on the payroll? That's where it gets complicated, Foster said, her expression grim. He uses initials and badge numbers, but they're coded. However, we did cross-reference some of the dates in the ledger with the precinct's arrest records. Whenever a dealer refused to pay Sullivan's tax, Bradley Hayes would suddenly discover a confidential informant tip, and that dealer's operation would get raided by the night shift squad. They were using the department's resources as their personal enforcement arm. Isaiah felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The rot wasn't just a few bad apples. It was an entire orchard poisoned to the roots. What about the missing grandson from this morning, David Higgins? The old woman in the lobby said he hadn't come home. Foster pulled a separate sheet of paper from the folder. I dug into that the second you mentioned it. David Higgins isn't just a random missing person. He works as a mechanic at the exact same East Side chop shop listed in Sullivan's ledger. Last night, that shop was hit. Not by us, but by a rival crew. 2 people were killed. David barely escaped. The pieces began snapping together in Isaiah's mind with terrifying clarity. Sullivan wasn't just ignoring Mrs. Higgins in the lobby out of cruelty. He and Hayes were actively trying to find the boy before he could talk. David Higgins was a witness. He knew Sullivan was protecting that shop. If David went to the state police or the FBI, Sullivan's entire empire would crumble. Exactly, Foster nodded. And it explains why they abducted Chloe Davis. We interviewed her extensively. She told us Sullivan kept asking her about her ex-boyfriend. Guess who her ex-boyfriend is? David Higgins, Isaiah breathed, his eyes widening slightly as the full scope of Sullivan's depravity revealed itself. They grabbed the girl to use her as bait. They were going to leverage her to flush David out of hiding, and then they were going to silence them both. Isaiah slammed his hand down on the table, the sharp crack echoing in the quiet office. The sheer scale of the betrayal was staggering. Men sworn to protect the city were actively hunting down innocent civilians to cover up their own blood-soaked extortion ring. Where is David Higgins now? Isaiah demanded. We don't know, Foster admitted. But if he survived the shootout at the chop shop, he's terrified, he's running, and he likely doesn't trust a single badge in this city. Isaiah stared at the black ledger, his mind racing through tactical permutations. If Sullivan had a crew inside the precinct loyal to him, someone else might still be hunting David. They needed to find the boy before the corrupt cops did, and they needed to break the encryption on Sullivan's coded network. Bring Sergeant Miller into interrogation room A, Isaiah ordered, his voice devoid of any warmth. He sat at that front desk for 5 years. He knows every shadow in this building. He knows the codes. He knows who is loyal to Sullivan. Miller is a seasoned cop, Captain, Foster warned gently. He knows the drill. He might lawyer up and stonewall us. Isaiah touched the bruised, swollen skin of his cheek, a dark, merciless smile touching the corners of his mouth. He can try, Isaiah whispered softly. But Miller is a coward who just watched his god bleed. I'm going to walk into that room, and I am going to dismantle his entire life piece by piece until he begs me to let him talk. Fluorescent light buzzed with a sickening electrical hum inside interrogation room A. Sergeant Miller sat bolted to the metal chair, his heavy arm shackled to the table ring. Sweat beaded on his forehead, rolling down his fleshy cheeks in thick, greasy trails. He flinched violently when the heavy steel door swung open. Isaiah Brooks stepped into the room, moving with the terrifying silent grace of an apex predator. He did not bring a notepad. He did not bring a junior detective to play good cop. He brought only Derek Sullivan's black leather ledger, dropping it onto the metal table with a heavy final thud. Isaiah did not sit down. He paced slowly around the perimeter of the small, suffocating room, letting the silence stretch until Miller looked like he was going to hyperventilate. "You have 22 years on the job, Miller," Isaiah said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "You have a pension waiting for you. You have a wife. A pension waiting for you. You have a wife named Diane and a daughter finishing her nursing degree at Wayne State University. I know this because I pulled your personnel file 5 minutes ago. Right now, you are looking at a minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary for racketeering, accessory to kidnapping, and corruption under the RICO Act." Miller sobbed a pathetic wet sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "Captain, you don't understand. Sullivan, he runs everything. If I crossed him, he would have planted narcotics in my locker. He would have ruined my life." "He has already ruined your life," Isaiah corrected sharply, stopping directly behind him and leaning down to whisper in his ear. "But I am the one who gets to decide where you spend the rest of it. You are going to translate every single initial in this ledger. And then you are going to tell me exactly where David Higgins is hiding, because if that boy dies tonight, I will personally charge you with felony murder." Miller squeezed his eyes shut, his entire body trembling. "It's too late, Captain. Sullivan got a tip 2 hours ago. The kid is hiding out at the old Michigan Central Station rail yard on the west side. Sullivan sent officers Ryan Fletcher and Todd Baker to handle it. They're off book, driving an unmarked black SUV. They're a hit squad, Captain. They aren't going to arrest him. They're going to put him in the dirt so he can never testify." Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded Isaiah's veins. He spun away from Miller and threw open the interrogation room door. Detective Sarah Foster and Deputy Chief Harrison were waiting in the hallway. "We have a designated hit squad active in the field," Isaiah barked, his command presence taking absolute control. "Officers Fletcher and Baker, they are heading to the Michigan Central Station rail yard to execute David Higgins. Foster, I want GPS tracking on their personal cell phones and any unmarked unit signed out of this precinct today. Harrison, mobilize the tactical response team. Nobody from the 54th rides with us. We use internal affairs and state troopers only." Within 10 minutes, a convoy of heavily armored unmarked tactical vehicles roared out of the headquarters' subterranean garage, their sirens cutting through the darkening city streets like screaming banshees. Isaiah rode in the lead SUV, a heavy Kevlar vest strapped tightly over his charcoal trench coat. He checked the chamber of his service weapon, his face a mask of pure, unyielding resolve. The bruise on his cheek throbbed with every bump in the road, serving as a bitter reminder of the monster he was hunting. Rain began to pour again as the convoy smashed through the rusted chain-link gates of the abandoned Michigan Central Station rail yard. Towering rusted shipping containers and decaying train cars created a labyrinth of steel and shadows beneath the skeletal remains of the once grand station. Ahead, parked haphazardly near a collapsed warehouse, was a black SUV. "Move, move, move!" Isaiah shouted over the radio. Searchlights from the tactical vehicles ignited, washing the muddy yard in blinding artificial daylight. Through the downpour, Isaiah spotted them. 2 men in dark civilian clothes with tactical holsters strapped to their thighs were dragging a battered, terrified young man toward the open trunk of their vehicle. David Higgins was bleeding from a head wound, struggling weakly against the 2 corrupt cops. "Police! "Drop your weapons!" Deputy Chief Harrison bellowed through a digital bullhorn, stepping out of the tactical truck behind a heavily armed strike team. A dozen assault rifles instantly trained their laser sights onto Fletcher and Baker's chests. Fletcher panicked, his hand instinctively dropping toward his holstered sidearm. "Don't you even breathe, Fletcher!" Isaiah's voice sliced through the chaos. He stepped out from the cover of the lead vehicle, his own weapon drawn and leveled flawlessly at the rogue officer. The blinding searchlights illuminated the bruised, fiercely determined face of the black man they all thought was just a powerless civilian. Baker immediately threw his hands into the air, dropping to his knees in the mud. "I'm out! Don't shoot! I surrender!" Fletcher hesitated for one agonizing second, looking at the dozen laser dots painting his torso. The absolute certainty in Isaiah's eyes told him everything he needed to know. She would drop him where he stood. No, he would. Slowly, Fletcher raised his hands and fell to his knees. Tactical officers swarmed them instantly, ripping their weapons away and slamming them into the mud to cuff them. Isaiah lowered his weapon and walked quickly toward David Higgins, who had collapsed onto the wet gravel, sobbing hysterically. He knelt beside him in the pouring rain, placing a gentle, reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're safe now, David," Isaiah said softly, the harsh edge of his command voice vanishing, replaced by profound empathy. "My name is Captain Brooks. We have Chloe, and she is safe too. The men who hurt you are never going to wear a badge again." David looked up at him, his tears mixing with the rain. For the first time in days, the terror in his eyes finally broke, replaced by overwhelming relief. Isaiah stood up, looking over the sprawling rail yard as the corrupt cops were hauled away in chains. The reign of terror at the 54th Precinct was officially extinguished. Justice doesn't just happen, it has to be ruthlessly enforced. Power does not corrupt. It reveals who a person truly is. Isaiah Brooks proved that true leadership means stepping directly into the darkest, most dangerous corners and dragging the monsters screaming into the light. Derek Sullivan, Bradley Hayes, and their corrupt crew received decades in federal prison, permanently shattering their reign of terror, while the 54th Precinct became a shining example of actual community policing under Isaiah's ironclad command. Did this explosive real-life story of justice, immense courage, and sweet revenge keep you on the absolute edge of your seat? If you loved watching this corrupt empire crumble to ashes, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories. Drop a comment below telling us what you think of Captain Brooks's ultimate takedown.